Hi, everyone. My name is Danny Nierenberg, and I'm president of the research and advocacy organization Food Tank. I'll be your moderator for today, and it's my huge honor and pleasure to welcome you to this virtual conversation about how boutique cannabis needs appellations. This was originally scheduled to be in person at South by Southwest in Austin, Texas in March, where we could all be together. But COVID-19 has created a new normal, so I'm still happy that we can come together virtually and talk to one another about this really important conversation. Before I begin, I want to thank LeafWorks and Double Forte for bringing us all together. And I also want to set the stage for this discussion and really briefly introduce our experts. An appellation of origin is a legally defined and protected geographical indication used to identify where food and other crops are grown. Think of champagne from Champagne or Parma ham from Parma, Italy. Really special places with specialty products that are delicious and world-renowned. The panel will focus on opportunities for boutique and medicinal producers of cannabis to capture their share of the global cannabis market, which is expected to reach more than $89 billion by 2024, $89 billion. To do that, producers will need to develop appellation of origin designations and protections for cannabis. What I really like about these appellations is that they not only honor the plant, but they honor the people who spent a lot of time breeding and cultivating these cannabis varieties. Today, we'll be hearing from people who are working to establish these appellations in Northern California and how what they're doing will impact the entire cannabis market worldwide. Let me just introduce them all very quickly, but you can find more about them online. First, we have Eleanor Kuntz, the co-founder of LeafWorks and the co-founder of Candor. LeafWorks is a genetics business specializing in plant DNA testing and consulting services for the natural products industries to help the supply chain and consumers know exactly what they're buying, selling, and growing. Essentially, it creates a lot of transparency where there was very little before. Candor is a nonprofit committed to preserving biodiversity of botanicals in the natural products industry through education and outreach. Next, we have Janine Cullen, who is joining us by phone. She is the founder and executive director of the Origins Council, a nonprofit education research and policy advocacy organization dedicated to driving sustainable rural economic development with cannabis producing regions and establishing nationally and internationally recognized, legally defensible, standards-based geographic indication systems for cannabis. She's a big job ahead of her. And last but not least, we have Swami Chaitanya from Swami Select. He has been called the Swami of pot and really is a guru around all things cannabis. He and his wife are craft cannabis farmers who are raising awareness around the benefits of sun-grown organic cannabis and the healing qualities of this ancient plant. Thank you all again for being part of this conversation. I want to dive right in. But I hope the next time we do this, it's in person. But again, this is a great option to meet with you all virtually. Eleanor, I'm wondering if you can describe to our viewers and listeners what cannabis appellations are and why we need them.
Cannabis appellations is a framework in which we can place cannabis into the world in which we live. And it values that intersection between the plant itself and the place in which it's grown. And so by establishing cannabis appellations, we really honor that connection between the plant and the place and the individuals that reside within that place and caretake, grow, and process those plants.
And why haven't these plants been valued before? Can you talk about sort of the prohibition that's been in place in many places for so long that's prohibited these appellations from being, developed?
Cannabis is a unique plant within an appellatory framework because it's experienced prohibition. And within prohibition, cannabis has really grown in diversity and has had a huge expansion in the biodiversity that's possible. And through that expansion of biodiversity with individuals growing that plant in very unique spaces, we have had the development of this very intimate connection between the land in which the plant has been grown and unique types of cannabis that are specifically grow not only within those regions, but excel and thrive within those regions. Prohibition has also pushed us to a point where we have this diversification in type. We see this across the globe, where we see wherever you have a thriving cannabis growing community, you tend to see both medicinal types and also functional types. And so whether it be for oil or fiber, you have a diversity of cannabis. And so it's really interesting to see within the United States how we've had an even more fine scale fractionation of the types of cannabis, where we have cannabis that's really been sought after for its recreational benefit, and then other types of medicinal cannabis that have all kinds of other chemical profiles that are really specifically positively indicated for different medicinal uses.
Yeah, the biodiversity range of cannabis is something that I had no idea of until we started this conversation, a few months ago, and it's so fascinating and so important. How do the organizations and the company you work for, LeafWorks and Candor, what are they adding to this process of appellations?
Well, one of the most fundamental things to understand about plants comes from definitions. And so it's impossible to move forward with any kind of appellatory framework or any kind of definitional framework if we don't have a handle on the plants themselves. And so the work of Candor Herbarium is fundamentally important in this endeavor. So what the Herbarium does is it acts as a repository to define the types of plants that we have within the community. And so we do this for all plants. When we find new plants in unique places, or we take plants that are common and we do lots of selective breeding and produce new types, whether it be an apple or a cucumber, we define those plants and we define what makes them special and unique. And so Candor is specifically focusing on cannabis because there's so much diversity that's not been documented. We have a situation in which people have a whole trove of treasures that they would like to move forward, and in order to claim those plants, whether it's at the community level or at the personal level, claim that long-standing history of breeding that's been done, you have to make definitions of those plants. And so from that baseline, we can then move forward and understand, okay, cultivar A or cultivar B really thrives in a certain region. And by connecting the dots of the plants that are defined with the place itself, we can really understand how those two intersect to make something that's more than 1 + 1 = 2. 1 + 1 = 10.
Absolutely. So interesting. I love what you said about trove of treasures and claiming the history that's there. And I know part of your concern is really about honoring the people and the communities who have been developing these really, interesting and very biodiverse crops. Can you talk more about how you're involving the communities themselves who've been breeding these cannabis varieties?
Of course. So registration through the Herbarium really allows organizations or individuals that have stewarded a particular plant or a particular group of plants to put down on paper and to put down for the world that, yes, we have been interacting with this plant, and it protects those individuals from those plants being stolen or used for other purposes, taken into other individuals' breeding regimes, and being propagated without their consent. It also helps to define the diversity that exists so that we can really look critically at some of these utility patents that are being granted right now for certain chemical profiles, understanding that those are probably exceptionally overarching and that we have many, many different evolutionary backgrounds or different cultivars that produce similar chemical profiles. And so it's an important way for the community itself to retain the ability to utilize the plants that they have been stewarding. It also is really important to us at the Herbarium to honor the history. So many of these plants have been bred in really amazing and trying circumstances. People love these plants and have done so much work that it would be a tragedy, in my opinion, to not recognize and really honor that history of connection between the, you know, the human and the plant itself. It's a very powerful, all of our domesticated plants, we have this very unique interconnected history with, but cannabis, it's almost exciting to look at what's happened, because it's been so, you know, there's been so many different versions of the same story, and so much passion has really gone into the production of these plants and the preservation of these plants. I mean, I've gone and I've met plants that are older than I am.
Wow.
And for an annual species, that's really saying something. That's a
Absolutely.
level of honor and care that I think is really emblematic of the community itself.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting, you know, that we've been talking about the people who've, you know, spent so much of their lives really dedicated themselves to preserving these plants and creating, you know, qualities that would otherwise not exist in these plants, and making them, you know, available for medicinal use as well as recreational use. But they've been villainized, you know, for doing something that, you know, lots of farmers do, which is grow crops.
I do want to get back to what Eleanor was talking about, because the process of how she does this documentation, I wanted her to describe that, and it's been fascinating. She has these blotter papers, and you get a cutting of a plant with the whole plant if you can, the leaves and the flowers and the roots and everything, and you put it between this very thick, pure blotter paper, and then you bind it together with a stack of maybe 20 of them, and you dry this thing out, and that's a visual record, a preservation of the flower itself. And to me, it was fascinating. He came and showed us how to do that. And I think for all of our listeners to get a picture of the fact that here's a plant, it's dry. You all probably dried flowers, but, you know, fell in your book or something like that, you know, as a kid. And it keeps the color. That's the amazing thing. It will keep the color and the shape and so on. So I think that's a fascinating process, and that's real. It's just, here's a plant and it's preserved and so on. So, and that's then the key thing for documenting how the plant is a product of its immediate environment.
Janine, I want to turn to you now. What has, you know, prohibition has prevented a lot of breeders and farmers from making cannabis profitable and allowing them to, you know, make a living off of it. Can you talk about how the appellation process in Northern California will help increase their ability to do their jobs?
Sure, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And this has been really a process in the works for the past 5 years. And in California, across the state, it's been, I think, an amazing example of community-driven policy, because appellation frameworks are many things. And one of the things that they are is a policy framework that really, I think, uniquely has the opportunity to transition traditional producers. So, you know, that means a certain thing in the United States, and it means an entirely different thing in other countries, you know, that have hundreds or thousands of years of history cultivating cannabis, into the new, you know, rapidly global paradigm of regulated production and marketplace. And it's a way to protect the intellectual property, the traditional knowledge, the genetic resources that have been stewarded by these communities for decades or centuries in a protected way into the new paradigm, and tastefully and respectfully market and leverage that IP for the financial and economic health, not just of those producers, but of their entire region. And so it has really kind of followed that track in California, in the sense that appellations are traditionally a farmer-driven movement, and that is definitely true here in California. And it's something that we've been collectively working on in coalition with our legacy producing regions for the past 5 years. So I think it's a really powerful beacon of what's possible when, you know, producing communities can come together and really utilize this amazing policy framework to protect and elevate their position in this new regulated world that we're endeavoring to step into and engage.
Absolutely, absolutely. Collective action is really, I think, like you said, the force behind this. it hasn't been an easy process over the last 5 years. Can you describe some of the challenges you faced?
Sure. I think, appellations by nature are deliberative, right? It's a process of negotiating boundaries, whether you're negotiating social boundaries, what are your collective values, negotiating with policymakers. And so there's always that element of struggle and triumph, frankly, that happens when we go through that difficult process of deliberating, negotiating, coming to consensus. And so that's a through thread, but it's not, it's inherent to the process. So that's been a challenge. But I think, more so is just the larger framework that we're negotiating in terms of, a multi-billion-dollar existing industry in California that's been built over decades. And that's been really centered around medicinal use and compassion, and the sort of policy wins that come from a fundamental premise that cannabis is medicine, that it's a human right, and now moving into the commercialization and the adult use paradigm, and in some ways, walking back some of those wins and awarenesses, and having to kind of reframe. And I think, again, appellations are an incredible tool for this because of the research that's inherent in it. And again, that, as Eleanor spoke so eloquently to, you're really, honoring and also really showing to the world the relationship between the farmer and the product, and also the consumer and the product. And I think it's a really powerful place for cannabis as a medicine to be really researched, codified, promoted, and substantiated further.
Can you talk a little bit about how these boundaries are developed?
Sure. So in a sort of summary, the process of appellations is that groups of farmers in a given region come together and they author a petition. And in the petition are essentially the rules of their appellation, and it includes shared practices, shared standards, the geographic boundaries, how they're defining why their region is specific and unique in terms of the causal link. And this is a really important concept. It's fundamental to appellations. It essentially describes that this product, this cannabis, is unique and it has unique qualities that are essentially due to the place. And so that includes human and environmental factors. And so the petition really kind of defines all of those parameters, and then it's put forward. In our case, the California Department of Food and Agriculture is the codifying body, so they would review it. And if the appellation petition is approved, then it would move forward, and those petitioners would receive a designation and be able to proudly use that designation on their products.
So interesting, and I don't think a lot of folks understand all of the research, as you said, that goes into this, and making sure that these appellations are transparent, that people really understand that these products are special, that they know the people who are growing them, that they know a lot about the region. Can you describe some of the breeders and farmers you work with? We'll hear from Swami in a little bit, but who are these folks? I mean, I think in a lot of people's minds, they think of cannabis growers as, doing something seedy, but these are real farmers who, as you and Eleanor have both pointed out, are stewards of the land. Can you describe some of them to us?
Sure. I would say one thing that has always amazed me about cannabis is how universal it is, and that the cannabis community as very diverse is a reflection of that. But the through thread I see, particularly with the breeding community, is that they are craftspersons, right? They are really passionate about their craft, and a lot of cultivators really approach it too as though they're engineers, right? They're really intimately engaged with all of the variables and factors that are feeding into the furthering of their craft, and it's really a living tradition that they're feeding into and building and developing. And so there's passion, and there's commitment, and there's a lot of creativity, and often they can be, I think, it's a sort of it's a closed community that's starting to bloom and open. And so that's an element that's really kind of fascinating. And I think appellations are so powerful because it's a safe way for them to open and share their craft while also protecting all of their work, right, and their intellectual property and their trade secrets. And so that's been a really cool piece to watch that blooming and opening happen.
For people to be recognized for that really special knowledge that they have, I think farmers, no matter what they're growing, are often not recognized for all of that inherent knowledge that they've developed. And, they're not just, producing a crop. They're, like you said, engineers, they're stewards, they're doing all of these different things. They have to be business people as well to make sure that they can continue their business. So it's really interesting. So, I'm not sure if COVID-19 has thrown a wrench into the policy process as you're going along in California. What's your best case scenario for when the appellations will be designated and go through as a policy framework?
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot of changes afoot with respect to all policy work in California. However, I believe it was about less than a week ago, the agency extended the public comment period. So right now they've promulgated a set of regulations. It's now open to public comment and review. And so that has been extended until May 6th. And from that point forward, we'll kind of see how things evolve and change. I know there's a lot of changes going on with state government right now. So we're still engaged in developing our analysis and public comment as pertains to the regulations. And I think we'll just kind of have to see how things play out as we move forward in this timeline.
Is there a way for voters in California to get involved in that process?
Yeah, so the public comment process is open for the public to engage in. If you go to the Cal Cannabis website, and I apologize, I don't have that in front of me right now. You can access the published regulations, the initial statement of reason, and other supporting documents. And then there's direction about how to submit public comment via email. And so that's all available on the Cal Cannabis website.
So Swami, I now want to turn to you. You're one of the craftspeople that both Janine and Eleanor have described. And I want to hear from you how important these appellations will be for breeders and growers of cannabis.
The immediate environment has numerous layers, and we talk about the biological and the geological, the meteorological, all these logicals out there about, what is affecting it. But, Janine has been talking about what we call the microbiome. Right? Now there's the biome of all the trees and plants around up above the earth, but there's also in the earth, there's all these organisms that are living creatures. And that's been the fascinating thing for a lot of us in the farming community to get into what is being called regenerative agriculture, and is based on what is called the soil food web. And, there's an old metaphysical statement which says that as above, so below, right? Absolutely. And it's one of those mystical statements that, and I always thought, well, as it is in heaven, here it is on earth, and so wherever heaven might be. But actually what it also means is here above the soil level, down below the soil level are numerous tiers and layers and a hierarchy of organisms. And at the very smallest are bacteria, right? And there are like literally millions and millions of bacteria in a little handful of soil, right? And then next up are things that are known, I think they're called archons, which are kind of like bacteria. Eleanor can correct me on that. And then there's nematodes, there's fungi, there's arthropods, and then there's the larger insects and lizards, and then there's animals up on top pooping and eating and so on. And all of this stuff is alive, and it's what grows things. And so, so if you have a forest, nobody actually fertilizes the forest. Nobody tills the soil. Nobody really even waters it, right? But everything that falls down from the tree during its life lands on the ground, and then that's mixed with other kind of things, poop and so on. But 2 feet below the surface of the soil, it's now not leaves and twigs and all these things. It's actually soil mulch and so on, humus and everything. And how did that happen? That happened because all those little insects and microbes and bacteria and fungi have eaten all the leaves and everything else and transformed it into the products that the plant is able to eat. So when I was learning about this, the thing that blew my mind the most was to realize that I always thought roots pull stuff up from the soil, and that's what they do. But the other thing that roots do is they do a thing called exude. They don't just exude joy and love and beauty and so on, but they exude sugar, carbohydrates out their roots. And what does that do? It brings bacteria to the roots, which then the fungi eat, and the fungi eat take the carbon from the carbohydrates that are put out, and everything's kind of either eating each other or dying and shedding and so on and so forth. So it's all totally integrated and dependent on everything else in this whole food chain. But what's happening around the roots is that the roots are putting stuff out to bring nutrients to them, which the fungi and the bacteria do, and then it comes up into the plant from the soil. So it's a total cyclical thing. Absolutely. And if you see that within the individual plant itself, you realize that plant is living from the soil, and the soil is the nature environment. And so what's happening is, as long as the plant is in the soil of the native place, then it's taking all the ingredients that the native place produces. So it's literally a product of the environment.
So that's what makes these cannabis appellations so important, because you're getting the cannabis from that place and the person who created it.
Yes, exactly. One of the things I like to remind people that maybe you remember the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, I believe it was in the Ukraine. And what happened, all the soil around it was contaminated with radiation. What did they do? They planted hemp all over the place. What did the hemp do? It pulled the radiation out of the soil. So that tells us cannabis is what they call a bioremediator, bioaccumulator. It pulls whatever. Mm-hmm. So if there's crap and junk and pesticides in the soil, the cannabis is going to pull that up. Absolutely. And they found that in the Central Valley and various places where they've been trying to grow huge industrial grows of cannabis on land that was formerly used to grow broccoli or whatever. But there were no pesticide regulations, and it's certainly not organic. So the soil itself is contaminated, and the plants are pulling that up. And testing labs are finding a lot of cannabis from old greenhouses that are recycled from flower growing and other places. They're not passing the test because of heavy metals, pesticides, and so on, which are just in the soil, right? If they grew two seasons worth of hemp, they might pull that all out, and then they could start growing pure cannabis. But whatever's in the soil and whatever's in the environment is making the cannabis what it is. And we can talk more about that as terms of terpenes and trichomes and cannabinoids too.
Absolutely.
Yes, what was your question?
No, I really like what you had to say about, you don't want to have a monoculture of cannabis like what's going on in the Central Valley. You want to make sure that this is part of a really integrated farm. And I think that's erasing a lot of the stigma that people have around cannabis growers. They think, oh, they're just growing cannabis, but that's not the case. You've been doing this a long time. Are you surprised that the stigma is lessening? Or did you ever expect this day to come when, cannabis growers could kind of be out in the open and not hiding, like they were probably in the 60s or when a lot of back-to-landers went, to try to grow more of it?
Well, the easy answer is probably not, but actually, yes, we did imagine this, because I remember one time, actually last year at 420, I was talking with Steve D'Angelo, and someone asked us that same question, and we both kind of looked at each other and said, when we were stoned and sitting around and just nothing to do, we would daydream about this, about, pre-rolls with branding, about how it would be available at the corner store and all those different things. And, but you see what happened over time. You mentioned the passion that people have. Janine was talking about the passion that the breeders have for what they're doing. And there's a certain thing about, if you grow long enough and you live out in the wilderness like we do, there's a spiritual dimension that reveals itself over time. And most of the really long-time growers up here have almost kind of a mission feeling about what they're doing. And they understand that this plant has a spiritual dimension, because you get high when you use it, but it's also part of teaching you about the soil, teaching you about community. Look, here, cannabis is now teaching us about appellations. It's teaching us about political organization. It's teaching us about reaching out to the whole world about regenerative farming. So cannabis never stops in its teaching and the way it impacts human beings.
No, and your passion is so evident, and Eleanor and Janine's too, in different ways around, you know, why this is so important. And I think a lot of it comes back, and maybe this is all something you all can comment on. It's about the trust and transparency that consumers need. They've come to expect it from their food. People want to know how their food was grown, who grew it, how animals were treated, how the land was treated. So that's put you, I think, you know, cannabis growers in maybe a better position than you were 40 years ago. But can you all comment on that need for trust and transparency that consumers really crave?
Yeah, it starts amongst the farmers ourselves, because back in the old days, you know, there was such risk that there was a community of understanding that had almost like a silent or psychic way of communicating with one another. And the community was really, really strong because, you know, if you lost your starts or a rat ate them or whatever it is, your neighbors would just give you some more seedling starts or what have you. People shared seeds, and there were like secret trees under which you could stash some money, since you couldn't use the telephone in those days.
Sure.
And people knew that was the special tree for messages and so on. So that was like, and Dylan has an old saying, you know, if you live outside the law, you must be honest. And so we had this industry of cannabis that went on for so long. And if you were a cheat or dishonest or something like that, at a certain point, you were kind of out of the community. There was a way that you were just sort of, you were out, you know. And so there was that sort of, the transparency was there, and it was all on the basis of a handshake, right? So now we have to preserve that, and we have to carry that forward. And I think the Appellations is kind of an institutionalization of that, because it's based on the farmers coming together themselves to create their standards and practices and isolate cultivars and so on. So it's coming out of, pun intended, the grassroots, that, you know, this is going to be something that the farmers create for themselves. And so that's going to be the transparency within that group. And so on, and the trust will have to be there.
Janine and Eleanor, I know this is part of the work that you both do every day around transparency, but can you comment on again, why consumers crave this and why it's important to you both as well?
Sure. This is one of the most fundamental principles that drives our company, LeafWorks, is offering transparency to the consumer. So it doesn't matter if you're buying a bottle of ginkgo at the store or you're buying a cannabis pre-roll. You want to know that the product that's inside that container is what is on the label. And with cannabis, there's a really unique space where once we move forward with definitions and really giving that history of that plant, it's exceptionally important to translate those names and those values that go along with where the plant is grown and what plant is in that bottle to the consumer itself. And there's multiple layers to this. I mean, the most basic layer is you want to have a consistent experience. As a brand, you want your consumers to have a consistent experience. So every time they're purchasing that product, whether it be flower or a tincture or a topical, you want them to have the same experience so that they'll go back to your product again and again. And if you have individuals that are using the same plant in different formularies, you really want to know that when you say a name, the name translates across brand as well. Absolutely. So that the names aren't just flippantly put out there and have no meaning.
It goes back to how we started this conversation. You want Parma ham from Parma to taste, you know, consistent wherever you're eating it. You know, if it's designated as Parma ham, it should be good.
Exactly. And you also want those individuals that are growing really unique and special plants to be able to leverage the fact that they're doing that, the fact that they have done the work to steward those plants. They've done the work to care for those plants. Bring them forward. You want those organizations and those farms and those families that have been taking care to be able to really move those plants into the greater world and benefit from the work and care that they have done. And so there's a lot of value in that transparency, and it all comes back to that name. And I want to, speak to what Swami was saying earlier about the herbarium. The herbarium, when you're pressing those plants, when you're taking those plant pressings and you're making it, it's really an immutable document. It's not like genetic sequencing or chemical profiling, which, anyone can go to the store and buy anything and either get a chemical profile or can get a genetic sequence. It doesn't actually attach that individual, that organization to the plant itself. But pressing a plant and having that physical documentation that can then be referenced really builds that attachment between the plant and the community or the individual that's taking care of that plant. And so when you have that connection, you really also want to be able to communicate that to your consumer. Mm-hmm. And that's why that transparency is so critical for us at LeafWorks.
That's fantastic. And I mean, I wanted to make it absolutely clear, because I think a lot of people, when they hear, the word appellations, or they, think that it's a way to get consumers to spend more money on a so-called special product. But that's not the case here. This is a lot of work has gone into this. And Janine, you've probably done more work than anybody to make sure that this process goes smoothly. Can you talk about that transparency angle as well?
Yeah, I'd love to speak to that. So I think for the legacy producing community in particular, there is a rather onerous obstacle that's going to happen over time, which is really, breaking down the barriers that were built by Prohibition in hearts and minds with respect to the community itself. And so appellations are a really powerful way to really convey to the consumer the standards, the values of the community, and the standards and practices that are translated through those values and into how the farming is executed and the final product. And because it's such a rigorous system in terms of the verification of those standards and the codification through the appellations process, it helps to build that consumer trust. But I think on a larger level, it helps to rewrite the narrative that's been, in many respects, not in all respects, but in many respects, falsely blanketed upon the cannabis cultivation community. And that's really powerful. And in my experience, outside of cannabis, I worked in marketing with Whole Foods Market for 12 years. And so I really witnessed what happened over time. It was the late 90s and into the early 2000s, and to really see what that process was for the consumer to be able to make that choice and trust that choice in terms of a third-party certification for organic or, origin-based products of place, and really kind of see the consumer connecting to the source of their product, the source of their food, understanding, the importance of localized production, the business practices behind the product, all of those things that you've worked on, extensively in your work, Danielle. And so I've seen it work. I have no doubt that it would work in market play. And I think the deliverables are so tremendous throughout the whole supply chain, so to speak, but really for the farmer and for the legacy producing community to be able to tell our narrative about how we are and have been stewards of the land and stewards of this plant and stewards of a value system that's behind that, and that Swami so eloquently spoke to and represents in his, day-to-day life. And so I think it's really powerful and sort of unparalleled with respect to a tool that really does that.
Absolutely, absolutely. I want to give Swami a chance to talk a little bit more about the idea of canna brands too, because I think that speaks to what, the marketing angle of this and making sure people know the story of the crop and the people behind it. Do you want to comment on that, Swami?
Well, yeah, that's marketing. And actually, first of all, I want to just thank both Eleanor and Janine for all the work you've done, and for Janine, the whole Origins Council, the Ministry of Appellation Project. She's just been tireless and relentless in her advocacy. So just to make it publicly known, it's like we wouldn't be anywhere without Janine. So thank you very much. Well, of course, in the United States and in Western culture in general, branding, of course, is the key thing. And branding is what Eleanor was referring to as the experience of using the product, right? Mm-hmm. And that's different. I learned recently from marketing, which is getting the product to the consumer, right? But we have so many people who have a really, really fervent brand loyalty, you know, like say in most extreme, of course, in the tobacco world, right? So this brand loyalty is something that it's kind of a sacred trust between the person who's making the product or the people who make the product and the people who use the product. And especially since our product is also a medicinal product, I think that sacred trust is even more important. Now, for all branding and marketing, everybody always says, I have a brother-in-law who's into marketing and so on. He said, the key thing is tell your story, right? Mm-hmm. People relate to stories out there. They want to hear stories. They want to know, and, you know, and make it a real story, right? You know, tell your own story and, you know,
tell the truth.
Make it right? So that's the thing that, you know, then that, in telling the story, you have a platform to talk about the values that go along and how those values are created. And so now in this, everyone's more conscious of germs and so on because of COVID-19 and so on. So, and also after the vape pen situation, the idea that you want to make sure that your product that you're putting in, either for your medicinal use or what I call your inspirational use, that it's a pure product and you're not going to suffer from it or what have you, and that product is going to do what you expect it to do. And so that guarantee is one of the things that Appellations is kind of like the fundamental of that. You got the brand, yes, and the brand in this country is mostly trademarks and so on, and that's really important stuff. And but the difference is that for a trademark on your brand, it's you own the trademark, and you as the owner must defend that trademark if someone abuses it. Now, we're trying to work with the Appellations that in France, for example, in Europe, if you have an appellation and someone violates it, you can complain, but it's the state that somehow steps in to try and enforce those standards and practices. And the regulations that have been put out don't really have an enforcement mechanism that would work, and it was sort of put back onto the backs of the people who are making the appellation petition themselves to sort of, quote, police it. So we need to beef that up a little bit more to have more of an enforcement situation. But the idea is that you're telling a story, and that story is your brand, and that it has to be basically a true story, but that is the way you get across your meaning, and you create that brand loyalty, which is really, really crucial. But the key thing with brand loyalty, of course, is keeping the quality, right? Mm-hmm. Keeping the quality up, that the product, you know, constantly delivers what it is that you're claiming it will deliver. But in terms of, you know, the thing about an appellation is that it belongs to a collectivity, a collective of the people making the petition. It doesn't belong to an individual. It likewise not really transferable to another place, whereas a trademark can be moved anywhere, right? And so there are certain things which have trademarks in them which have a geographical name, which is going to be kind of a problem down the line, and we need to have the regulations deal with the situation a little more clearly. That, for example, there's a cultivar called San Fernando Valley Kush. Well, it probably started out as an indoor cultivar, and now if I'm growing San Fernando Valley Kush up in Mendocino, is somewhat confused. So those are kind of issues that have to do with branding and naming and so on, which are more like copyright or trademark. Whereas the appellation then would determine, say, well, if you want to be in our appellation, you have to grow this cultivar, or this cultivar, but you are not allowed to grow these other ones. And all of that stuff is what the farmers themselves in this process will have the ability to decide through, a democratic process.
And what would be your preference?
Well, I have my preferences for the entire appellation thing. And my first preference is that we have to have baseline standards. And I think that the state really should set those baseline standards to say, this is the minimum. If you don't do this, you can't even apply. And that would be basically that the plants are either in the ground or in touch of the native soil, right? That they're grown in full sun. And also what I say for the long season, but it's also more without artificial light in the flowering period. And those are specific things. But basically in the ground, full sun, long season are what I would like to see. I think every group should also probably include organic in that baseline as well, but that's going to be, but these are up to each individual petitioning group, right? But I think what we need is that baseline.
Yeah.
If you're not in the sun, in the ground, you're going to have, so, but I also think that I want to say this particularly, there are people who are growing indoors and people who are growing mixed light, who are growing very fine cannabis.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them are really doing things as well and proper with best practices that they can. And they're saying, well, we want appellation too. And I say, well, basically you can't have appellation because it has to be in the ground, full sun, long season. But for those who are growing with mixed light and growing indoors, I would suggest that you make your own certification so that you have certain standards for mixed light and certain standards for indoor growing that say you are doing your environmental best, you are doing your best to create a pure product, you are doing your best to protect your workers so that they're not exposed to too much CO2 or too much sulfur, what have you.
Absolutely.
And you make those standards there for indoor, that you now, for indoor at a higher level, and you've got a certification from an indoor group. Likewise for mixed light. And then we get appellation for outdoor sun grown, which is our certification. And then you have that and we have ours, and let's all work together.
Absolutely. And, that's very similar to what's going on in the produce community. Hydroponics, has wanted organic certification, but it's not grown in the soil. But I think you're absolutely right. Having these different groups have their own sort of certification standards would help create more transparency and help those growers a lot as well. I've really so appreciated this conversation with the three of you because there's a real legacy that you're working to protect. And it's not just around the cannabis varieties, but it's around the people who've developed these varieties and who've worked so hard to grow them in the face of so much opposition and during Prohibition and a lot of stigmatization. And they have been doing it with, their environmental values and quality in mind. And so it's just been very inspiring to hear from you all and the different ways you're sort of coming to this issue and trying to create better practices and create a better, economic opportunities for cannabis growers, not just in California, but what you do in California will have big impacts all over the world. And Janine, I'm wondering if you can comment on what, this process means for the rest of the world, and maybe Eleanor as well. Maybe all three of you can comment. What will this mean for cannabis growers worldwide?
Thanks. Well, first I'd like to follow Swami's lead, and he is one of the founding board members of the Mendocino Appellations Project and serves on the board of Origins Council. And likewise, it's been quite a pleasure to work with Eleanor and her team through Candor. We've been working together, and she's one of our advisors. And so I'm really blessed to be working intimately with both of these luminaries. And I think that this is such a prescient point because we are setting precedents in California. This will be the world's first appellation of origin system for cannabis. And there are certainly other states and other countries watching this. And part of our work extends through one of our board members, Michael Krowitz, and he's been working internationally on cannabis reform, rescheduling of cannabis in the international treaties, and engaging with the World Health Organization and also the World Intellectual Property Organization. And so it's a very kind of real-time development as we work to solidify this particular set of regulations and refine the process. It's going to really spark the creation of policy, I think, around the world pretty immediately. So this is a really significant moment, and I really want to emphasize something that sort of the conversation up to this point has led to, which is that, again, it's really a farmer-driven movement, and one of the things that's really important about appellations is that they are standards-based. So in the family of geographic indications, we do have other geographic indications that are not standards-based, that are more baseline with respect to indication of source. So the product was produced in the place, but how was it produced in the place? And it's really appellation of origin and the standards tied to it that speak to this terroir, this essential relationship between the product and the place. And the farmers that have advocated for this over the years have really asked to put these voluntary standards in place so that we can be true to an international tradition, which is appellation of origin, that's fundamentally based on that transparency to the consumer and that verification and celebration of our standards. And so I think that's a really powerful piece and a very distinct piece to really kind of celebrate.
Absolutely. Eleanor, did you want to comment as well?
Well, I think it's very important to realize that anything that's really great, we're going to ship around the world. And so the establishment of appellations in California will just open the floodgates of not only the ability to eventually be able to market our amazing California cannabis across the planet, but also to set a standard that other countries follow suit on. And as we have with many of our other most, I always like to take a step back and think, move. And we go from place to place, which humans have done for millennia, right? We're always moving and shifting and dreaming. And as we do that, the things we take with us are our foods and our medicines and our sacred plants. And cannabis falls into at least two of those categories. Actually, it falls into all three. And so it's such an important plant that we've carried with us for a long time, that it's a plant that really connects us globally. And Prohibition, we've been forced to sort of hide our love and our affection for this plant. But as that opens and blossoms, we're really going to see the same thing that has always happened. Our most important and most valuable plants will travel the globe with us. And so having appellations that are really indicative of that cultural value, the plant value, and the intersection of the two will translate globally.
Well, the international thing, of course, is one of my favorite aspects of all of this because, I've been in Nepal and smoked wonderful cannabis there, in India, and various other places, in Amsterdam. I've smoked cannabis from, Lebanon, from Morocco, all over the place. And that's one thing that we do have to keep in mind. We feel we're right on the cutting edge forefront here in California, but this cannabis trade and cannabis consumption, we have absolute documented evidence that's at least from 5000 BC. And it clearly was much older than that. And there are some people who claim that cannabis and its seeds had an effect in teaching people agriculture and how to grow things from seeds, and also to take the plant that it has multiple uses. No plant has more uses than cannabis and hemp. But we do have to remember that there are all of those people growing in all those places, Morocco, etc., Thailand, and so on. They're all small farmers, mostly all of them, right? And they're all, living in little villages. And this is a tradition that goes back, years and years and years, centuries. And they have their own special ways. And, people know that Nepali hash is different from Afghani hash, right? The Colombian weed is different from Thai weed. And the Acapulco gold was different from Panama red, et cetera, et cetera. And these things are part of the folklore and history of cannabis. And so now, hopefully, what will happen as these countries legalize it, now all of these growers won't have to be hiding out and so on. And they will finally get full value for their products. And so that if we can get Nepali hash or, a Temple Ball or Bombay Black or something like that here in California and know that it's real, right? That the label, as Eleanor was saying, that the label tells you really what's in there. And that means that it's a worldwide trade going all ways. It's not just us going out, it's they're coming in. And the seeds, Absolutely. The other thing now about seeds going all around the world, which they do now clandestinely, of course, but all this stuff coming out in the open, and it has to be, Janine touched on the international part, but there's the World Health Organization that after Japan and other countries petitioned them to say, well, let's take a look at cannabis. The World Health Organization did, about 6 years of research, and they found all of these traditional medicine practices that use cannabis, and it's documented. It's written up in their text. It's used constantly every day. even within India, there are 3 different medical systems that use cannabis. In Africa, all over the place. So the World Health Organization finally got off its high horse. They had a panel of like 20 experts on addiction, and they decided that cannabis is a traditional medicine. And it's also, what even more important than this, is also known as a complementary medicine, which says that when you use cannabis in conjunction with other medical practices, it can either replace or augment or make it all work a little better. And so this was a fundamental change on the top level of the World Health Organization to say, they not just are saying this, they're saying we need to preserve these traditional medical methodologies so that they don't get lost, because in so many communities, that's the only thing people can afford. And it's local, and they use local herbs and all of that. And cannabis is part of that. It's one of the key things that all these local places. I've been in Nepal and India, walk along, and all of a sudden, there's like 25 cannabis plants in front of you that are all 15 feet high. Wow. And it's just part of the local environment. People are not scared of it. They use it. And so we're getting beyond the stigma. Now this being called essential business in the COVID-19 is a big step forward. Absolutely. And we just have to keep serving our community now out in public and sharing what we have and trying to make our product as pure and clean as possible.
That's such a great point to end on. This has been such an inspiring conversation. I mean, this is a really historic moment, and thanks to people like Janine with the Origins Council and people like Eleanor who are, getting the genetic verification down for these plants, and of course growers like Swami. This is the time to remove that stigma and allow growers to do their jobs and protect their land, protect their communities, and protect their health. I'm so inspired by all of you. Thank you so much for being part of this conversation.